Hey guys, so today my presentation is going to be on exactly what big data needs. And that's going to be my presentation or proposal as to why big data would need a code of ethical practices moving forward. As we know, big data is everywhere in this day and age. There's tons of information being covered and captured and collected and sold and moved and all that stuff. So the ethical uses of big data is a huge issue that has been on the forefront for a couple of years now, and it's kind of taken a kind of sit in the back seat, in my opinion, and rightfully so, compared to some other issues that we're dealing with today on a global basis. But my presentation is going to be kind of digging into what ethical practices I would recommend, how we're using analytics today, some uses of analytics, and whether it's good and bad, and what we're doing today to protect ourselves from any unethical practices. So let's get into it. So today's topics, as I said, we're going to be going to how big data is being used today, good and bad. I'll kind of lay out why ethical practices are a necessity, what's being done to protect our information today, and my actual proposal, what steps and things that we need in place to help protect ourselves and the future of big data analytics. So today, big data is used for a bunch of different reasons. So I'm listing out some examples of three great ways big data is being used and three kind of scary ways, in my opinion, of how big data is being used. So a great way that big data is being analyzed and utilized, is computing today is very strong and very powerful due to big data. We can decode DNA sequences in minutes, which allow us to help find new cures and understand diseases and their patterns a lot better than we were able to in the healthcare field. So we can create algorithms today using big data to help, monitor a baby's heartbeat, for example, in order to predict whether or not that baby will have an infection in a couple of days or so before symptoms even evident. So big data in healthcare is pretty cool, and it's a great way it's being utilized there. Also in sports performance, from an organizational standpoint, big data is utilized very heavily in sports. For example, there was the movie Moneyball that talks about how the Oakland A's use big data to measure and track performance patterns of their personnel in order to make more informed spending decisions and game time decisions to help optimize performance on the field. And it definitely worked in spades for them. Big data is being used to improve a country's infrastructure on many instances. Some examples are, a country can now optimize public transportation traffic flows by combining social media data and weather data to allow traffic signals to predict traffic volumes at certain times. And this will help operate and minimize traffic jams. And this will reduce the amount of collisions and accidents there are. So it'll make the country and the city as a whole run more efficiently and spend their dollars and cents more efficiently. So those are just some great examples as to how big data is being used at a holistic level with some simple examples. Some kind of scary ways big data is being used is, predictive policing. There's an example in Chicago, I think in 2014, in February, where Chicago PD used big data to make visits to individuals they identified as more likely to commit crimes in the future. And that sounds very similar to a movie called Minority Report. I think there's a show out now on Fox about that, but essentially it's the same type of idea where we're predicting individuals who haven't committed a crime, but they're more likely to. So Chicago PD used big data to point out and single out these individuals and kind of pay a visit to them to ensure that they're kind of staying in line there. Also, predatory marketing. Data brokers, sell data today that highlight financially vulnerable individuals. For example, a big data broker might use big data to gather data on individuals with, little to no savings in order to sell to a financial institution to allow that institution to identify whether or not those individuals would be, candidates for selling reverse mortgage to. So those can be very kind of sketchy practices, but it's done every day, and it's kind of a scary way because that's just the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion. Also, life expectancy algorithms. Major retailers like Walmart and Target use algorithms to determine their customers' life expectancy rates, which is crazy. And they base all this off of their customers' purchasing habits. So it's still not exactly clear what they do with that information, but they can predict how long their customers may live. So if you're a Walmart and Target customer and you utilize their pharmacies, uh, be careful because it may result in your insurance rates going up based on what you're buying in their pharmacies. So that's kind of scary in my opinion, and that's very important to be cognizant of because big data is a great thing and it's also can be a scary thing, as you can see with these examples. So um, kind of segueing into this slide here, why ethical practices are a necessity. It's mainly because there's a ton of data out there today. There's very little, as I mentioned, that can't be tracked online or even offline. And all of this data needs to be regulated and treated like a resource, like crude oil, for example. It's predicted that by 2020, there will be over 44 zettabytes of information stored globally. If you do the math, that's over 6,000 gigabytes of data for every person on Earth, which is absurd. Most of the data, in fact, will be stored consumer information. So there needs to be some ethical practices in place to ensure that this type of consumer data is not abused or used for unethical reasons, like some of the examples I listed before. Um, so let's keep going on there. Just want to paint a little picture as to what that means there. So big data can also be hard to understand. There's tons of information out there, and companies like Apple and Google or even Instagram have privacy policies in place that very few people actually read, let alone understand. So when the masses don't understand these data privacy policies and what these companies what they have in place to help kind of identify what the what type of power individuals have, most don't even understand it. So they're potentially setting themselves up. I know I fall victim to this sometimes, or I'm guilty of this, for potential manipulation or even intrusive data practices. And in fact, some of those companies that I listed before have even been called out upon that. So privacy is a huge, huge issue for social media companies and companies like Apple and Google that are just about everywhere. Um, Also, consumers or professionals, today, if you just ask a random person, most people can't even identify a governing body of big data and analytics. And because big data is gathered electronically, most people would assume that the ethical collection of data and even the dissemination of the data is only an IT issue. In fact, I really believe it's kind of everybody's issue since there's data on all of us. It's everybody's job to ensure that data is used in an appropriate manner. That's from the top down in every company and organization. So in order to make ethics of data a more widespread known issue, I really believe a governing body needs to be created in order to ensure that there are standard practices in place and penalties if those practices aren't adhered to. And the governing body would be crucial and important in setting the ethical standards that all companies that gather data must adhere to in order to protect ourselves, the consumer, a little bit more. In some examples, finance, the finance industry has the SEC. Even collegiate sports, they have the NCAA, and just some examples there. I think the big data needs its own version of the SEC. So what's being done today to protect our information? So Citigroup, Target, Walgreens, Apple, Sony, those are just some examples I've listed here, but what they all have in common is that they've all been victims of recent customer hacks. They've all had their customer information stolen by hackers. Sony's PlayStation platform failed to protect account information for up to 100 million customers worldwide, which is a staggering number. And in fact, that was one of those people that was a victim to that. So I can definitely attest to this. Also, Apple admitted they stored their user information in iTunes through unencrypted files, which made hacking extremely easy. And they were a result of being hacked as well. So with so many companies like these facing hackers and attacks, and these are wide-known large corporations, it's no wonder a lot of companies like this have resulted in reacting with creating such roles as the Chief Privacy Officer, which are CPOs, Chief Safety Officers, and the Chief Privacy Officer. And more companies are going to be following suit to help protect the consumer's information, which is a good step in the right direction, but honestly, it's not enough. There's legislation today. In a bipartisan effort, I believe John McCain and John Kerry proposed the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights Act in 2011, and there was a Do Not Track Online Act of 2011 as well. Those bills were set to help restrict what online companies can do with their consumers' data. And even in Europe, there's been legislation to help kind of accomplish the same type of thing. So these are just bills. So step in the right direction, but once again, not enough. There's also the DAA, which is the Digital Advertising Alliance. This is kind of the closest thing we have to a standard governing body of data. They've introduced their own privacy framework to ensure consumers' data is kind of handled with care, protected adequately, but not all companies are, I don't believe any companies actually are forced to adhere to their standard practices, but you can sign yourself up and join the DAA to adhere to them. There's also the prospects of being mobile friendly with data practices and trying to figure out how to track mobile ethical practices, which is a whole other conversation there. But those are some of the examples of what's being done today to help protect our information. Now, these are some, couple of steps, what I think are great steps in the right direction, and what I believe needs to be done to help enhance the ethical practices of big data. Privacy by design. The Privacy Commissioner in the province of Ontario, Canada, coined this phrase, which I love, and it encourages companies to incorporate ethical data practices into every aspect of their business and products from the beginning. So it's kind of a guideline more so than a rule. The simplest of settings and transparency. This is a huge piece as well. There are companies like Facebook that just use a really simple example that use relatively simple procedures to help set privacy measures. So a lot of companies should follow their design and simplicity to make setting ethical practices kind of the norm, and have the consumers allow them to do something about it. As I mentioned before, a governing body. There needs to be more bodies in place like the DAA to help ensure that ethical practices are more widespread. And lastly, the open lines of communication. I think this is very, very important. There are pixels, JavaScript, cookies, etc. that exist today to track customer movements online, but the average consumer doesn't even know what those things are or what those things do. So if companies can communicate to the consumers what they know about them, that would be a huge step in providing transparency and helping with ethical practices in big data. If company A tells me that they know XYZ about me, and I know that, and I can choose whether or not I want them to know XYZ about me, that's huge. Companies like Google, I believe, are doing things like that already, but I really believe more companies, in fact, should follow suit and really follow their lead there. And I believe there's a simple URL you can find off of Google's page to find out what they know about you. It's kind of weird saying that, but it's the truth. So that's kind of my picture of the big data ecosystem landscape and what I think needs to be done in order to provide more ethical procedures and standard procedures as a whole to protect the consumer. And I really feel that this would be all of these steps, and the problems that we have in place are going to be more widespread as time goes on. So let's hope that happens. Have a good day.